So the child learns very quickly who sets the agenda for learning. Right? Kids are very smart. They figure this out quickly. This has little to do with what I'm interested in, what my life is about, what matters to me. It has everything to do with what she says I should learn. And oh, by the way, who then tells you if you've learned? When you were 9 months or 10 months or 12 months or 13 months old and you're learning to walk, the relationship with adults around you is totally different. Right? The adults are very important because you're learning to walk in a community of walkers. Right? So you see people walking all around you. That kind of, I want to join in. I want to be part of that community. And your big brother just came and whacked you and ran away. So you really want to catch him. Right? So you have a social context. The social context is very important. But do you need a parent to tell you you're walking? Think about it. Who tells you you're walking? The parent might be encouraging you. Of course, that's the natural thing that parents will do. They'll be positive. They'll be encouraging. You can do it. That was wonderful. But who is it who makes the assessment? The learner makes the assessment. That's called lifelong learning. The learner's own motivation, the learner's own assessment. School is radically different because now the teacher tells me what I'm going to learn and the teacher tells me whether or not I have learned. It's a power system that kids are brought into. And why is that? Because they were going to go to work in factories. And the factory boss was going to tell them how much they had to produce and what had to be produced, and then they would tell them if they were successful. School is a system for learning obedience to authority. I'm just saying what it is. That's its fundamental purpose in many ways. Remember I said it's a system of socialization. We have to understand the history of this. Otherwise, it's all kind of crazy. The last part, in many ways the craziest part, is the idea of standardization. Right? Now, think again why standardization is so important. It's an easy question. If you think about an assembly line. Right? What is it that makes a good assembly line versus a bad assembly line? Everything coming off the assembly line conforms to the specifications of standards in the assembly line. If everything coming off the assembly line is a little bit different, and no one knows how different it'll be, that's called a very bad assembly line. Right? In modern statistical quality control, they would say high variation. Way too high variation. Bad assembly line. That's called nature. That's called nature. Nature has high variation. Think about it. No two leaves identical. No two blades of grass identical. No two human beings identical. Nature has a kind of love affair with variety. Nature's incapable of producing two identical things. School is fundamentally opposed to nature. Sorry. Don't take this as a criticism as an educator. I'm not criticizing you as teachers. I'm trying to help us reflect on the system of which we're a part. This is not about us as individuals. Most teachers are struggling with this because part of their own deepest concern is the well-being of those children. And do those children really grow to be who they are? That's why they're a teacher. And they're caught in an assembly line. And it's gotten worse for most, not better, in the last 10 years. Because around the world, starting in the United States particularly, we've had a whole movement how to turn around failing schools based on tests of standardized nature to test standardized accomplishments. I have a quote. It's actually one of the things I wrote for that book, Schools That Learn, is an essay. So everything I've been saying is in the opening of that book on the history of the industrial age school. And I have a quote in there where a noted educator says, "Our schools are failing. The only way to turn around our schools is to increase the use of standardized testing and make teachers and educators accountable for accomplishing those goals." The quote is from 1830 in a Boston newspaper. And that's exactly what we still do. And the large message about that is so that our society can compete. The wombat had a different message, remember? He said, it's not about beating those people, it's about living with those people. I guarantee you, beating the Chinese is not our biggest problem today. It's living with the Chinese. Now, don't get me wrong. I spent much of my time in the last 25 years in business. I'm very, I understand the business world. But I'm telling you that our national competitiveness is of small value if we fail as a species. It's kind of obvious. Most kids understand that today. Think about it. Part of the historic period we live in today is children, for the first time probably in human history, all around the world are growing up in the world. They're aware of the world in ways you and I were never aware of when we were children. They might very well have friendships with somebody who lives 10,000 miles away. They have a consciousness that's very much embedded in the state of the world. Even poorer children. Now, I understand there's a big difference, but more and more kids are very aware of what's going on around the world, and they're not very confident. In the United States, 80% of high school seniors, kids graduating from secondary school, express deep concern about the future. They're not very confident. They don't see the adults around them as being very serious about the real issues that will shape their future. It's a phenomenon for kids around the world. It's ignored by teachers by and large because it's not part of the standardized curriculum. And consequently, the kids see school as less and less relevant to their life. They have to do it because they don't have a choice. But it's not exactly what they would do if they were really picking how they would spend their time. So these are deep problems. And there are problems everywhere around the world. I spend a fair amount of time these days, not only in schools, but in Washington. There's a very interesting group of people who've come into Washington now in the Obama administration, in our federal or national Department of Education. Good folks, very knowledgeable, but very much caught in the same system still. Everybody's caught in the same system. Even Obama gives his speeches, and he talks about competing with the Chinese. Okay? Because we're caught in that mindset. On the other hand, I'll guarantee you the kids, all that talk about competing, it doesn't really register to them. They're much more interested in trying to, have friends who are in China, or friends who are in India, or friends who are in Africa. Because that's the world they live in, and that's the natural orientation of kids. We're social animals. Human beings are social by our nature. A lot of the biggest dilemmas that kids face are on the playground, right? They're in their relationships with one another. And that's why I told you the story about the traditional Chinese education. Think about kids who spend 2 hours a day chanting together. And just think of what it does. I'm not saying it solves all their interpersonal problems. Of course not. People are different. We have clashes. We have conflicts. It's our nature. There's nothing wrong with that. Learning how to deal with that is a lot of what education is supposed to be about. This person seems really crazy. Fine. I have to live with this person. That person probably thinks I'm really crazy. They have to live with me. Remember the little picture? These are your neighbors. You better learn how to live with them because they're living with you. That's the world we live in today. So, let me try to summarize in a couple of the developments. I mentioned one or two earlier. I think we're in an era where we're right at the beginning of what could be something quite analogous to 1750, 1800, the beginning of the industrial age schools. Okay? Because they were radical. Keep in mind, there is another type of school historically in most societies between apprenticeship, which has been there for tens of thousands of years, and the industrial age school. It's more the one-room school. And in most societies, it was more for the elite or people who had enough money. It wasn't for everybody. Okay, so most kids, did not have access to school. Different societies, depending on how they organized and how they prioritized. I don't know the statistics, because of course, who knows statistics from 2,000 years ago? What percentage of Chinese kids had access to the kind of school that I've seen, that I was talking to you about, this traditional school? But my impression is, in many parts of China, it was quite a good percentage. It wasn't just for the elite. because there was a kind of an education ethic in the society, as there are in a lot of societies. But that said, the nature of the school was basically a one-room school. My mentor, I have had a couple of really important mentors in my life, but at MIT I had one mentor for 10 years. A very famous man in the history of technology. He led the team at MIT that built the first digital computers. So if there's an inventor of the computer, it's him. And that whole team has got a whole floor at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. Okay? He invented core memory. Core memory was the breakthrough that led to digital computation. Jay, his name is Jay Forrester, went to a one-room school in rural Nebraska as a child, K to 12. And he said it was very interesting. Everybody taught everybody, but you didn't have a choice. You had one teacher, and you had maybe 30 kids, because this is rural environment, so they came from ranches and farms. But all the kids had to teach each other. This is the only way it works. No way one teacher is going to teach 30 kids who are age range 5 to 18. Not going to happen. They'll present different pieces, but the kids have to help each other. So he said, a lot of what I learned by teaching other kids. Why don't we do that more in school? Think about it. Everywhere schools say we don't have enough resources, we don't have enough teachers. How many kids do you have in a classroom? 30, 40, 50, 60? You have 60 teachers. But we don't think that way. Because we don't think about how the kids can help each other. Think about it. When do you really learn something? Often when you teach somebody. How do you design a classroom so the kids are learning with and from each other? If you walk into a classroom in what we often call systems thinking schools, there's a whole network of schools in the United States that we call the systems thinking schools. Many of them have been at it for 20 years. Interestingly, a bit of irony, it started in a city in southern Arizona called Tucson, Arizona, because Gordon Brown, the man I quoted, retired and moved there. So Gordon, the former dean of the engineering school at MIT, lived in a suburban community in Tucson. And he got the local school really excited about, why don't you teach kids to understand systems? They, what are you talking about? That sounds like MIT. That sounds way too technical. I said, no. Family. A family is a system. Kids are masterful at understanding families. We're all systems thinkers by our nature, but we have no education system that develops that ability. And they started in that school. Today, 20 years later, there's a whole network of schools in Tucson and hundreds of teachers who all create very different kinds of schools, regular old public schools. In the last 10 years, they've concentrated on poorer schools. Because Gordon lived in a suburb, it was upper middle class. So that first school, people said, well, sure, you do amazing things in that school, but those kids come from very stable home lives. They have a lot of money, da-da-da-da. So for the last 10 years, they've concentrated in poor schools. In Tucson has a large Hispanic population. Schools that have 2/3 or more what we call English as second language learners. Kids who do not grow up speaking English. They grow up speaking Spanish. You walk into any of those schools, and you will see kids sitting at tables together. You will not see a room like this. You will not see separate desks. You'll see kids clustered around tables because they're continually helping each other learn. You'll rarely see a teacher talk for more than 10 minutes at a time. The teacher poses questions, invites challenges. The kids talk with each other. And then at some point, the kids have ideas. The kids share them back with the teacher. The teacher says, oh, that's interesting. I don't think you've really thought it through enough. You should talk some more. And they go back and talk some more. That's the way a typical classroom works. Okay? I had a friend come with me from Mexico. She's a very, very successful educational innovator in Mexico. She's trained 25,000 teachers in a very particular methodology for bringing art back into schools. But it's really bringing reflection and kids thinking. Here's the question in her program. It's called Developing Intelligence Through Art. You look at a piece of visual art, and then the teacher says, what does this mean to you? What do you see here? There's no right answer, right? So the teacher, to do that, has to teach in a totally different way. They have to create a space for kids to talk to each other, to reflect. And the kid says, oh, well, that person's very angry. The teacher will say, what do you see that makes you think the person's angry? Oh, well, it's their eyes. Oh, what is it about their eyes? So you get a feeling. The whole educational pedagogy is transformed to being reflective, learner-centered, no right answer and wrong answer. But the kids have to create that environment for each other. 25,000 teachers have been trained in this in Mexico. It's spreading throughout Mexican schools. She came with me to visit these schools in Tucson. And she said, I've never seen anything like this. She said, in Mexico, my country, resources is the number one issue. Everybody thinks we can't compete internationally because we don't have enough money for every kid to have a computer. She said, what they're doing here has nothing to do with money. It's not about money. It's about mindset. It's about actually believing you can have a system of education that, one, is about developing real intelligence, how to think for yourself. Two, it's about creating a social environment where kids are recognizing that they're part of creating the learning environment for each other. In other words, it's about respect, it's about listening, it's about relationships. And three, it's about what, as educators, we would call higher order skills. I'm going to stop for a second and we'll just chat. But maybe before we wrap up, I'll show you a little video of 3 6-year-old boys from one of these schools. If you visit these schools, you will be stunned by what an 8-year-old is doing. The systems that they are understanding, the sophistication of their thinking, their self-confidence in their own expression, is it's the way the schools are designed. As she said, this has nothing to do with resources. Ultimately, it has to do with vision and imagination and a different concept of school. Now, please don't get me wrong. Resources do matter, of course. But when you think about using more and more resources in a traditional, industrial, assembly line, standardized school, you'll get one kind of consequence. If you think about better resources in schools that are really learner-centered, focused on higher order thinking skills, designed so that everybody is in a continual learning process, teachers, students, all learning together, you'll use resources in a very different way. So, when Claudia saw these schools, she said, I had no idea, and I've heard so many adults say this, I had no idea that kids at this age could be this articulate. We just had a 15-year celebration of her program in Mexico 3 weeks ago. The Minister of Education gave the first talk because he supports this art program in all the schools. Oh, but he actually wasn't first. He was preceded by an 8-year-old student. The 8-year-old student talked first. And again, people all say the same thing. I can't believe how articulate an 8-year-old can be. Believe me, it has nothing to do about an 8-year-old. It has to do with the nature of the educational environment. Are kids really developing their sense of who they are as human beings? Are they really developing their sense of relationship with each other? Are they developing their natural sense of responsibility for fairness amongst each other? Are they becoming more and more connected and feeling more connected to their world and their sense of responsibility for their communities? Those are timeless questions for educators. And they're really timely today. As the Wombat said, one Earth, that's all. We don't have 2, we don't have 3, we have 1. And we're now forced. We have no option. We have to learn to live together. That's what schools will more and more have to be about. We call them system citizenship. You know, schools are about being system citizens, being a citizen of the systems in which you live. We are connected all around the world. And by the way, when you do that well, all the basic skills get learned much faster. This is one of the big ideas that's now becoming very clear in these innovative schools. If you immerse the kids in settings that are about reflection, developing my own understanding, thinking things through for myself, being responsible for creating environments for each other to do that, and you're immersed in understanding interdependence, what we would call a systems environment, all the basic skills get learned much faster and deeper. So it's not either or. And while I say, well, I don't think it's all about competitiveness, but of course, at one level it is. We can't be crazy. We live in a society where right now, a lot of our priorities are about competitiveness. So we have to say, well, how can this be both? How can we both be helping kids learn how to live more harmoniously in the world and be good engineers? and be good contributors in the way society is looking for now. I don't think it's either or at all. I think those people who understand multiple intelligences will tell you that the linguistic and logical deductive intelligence, what Nick said, the two that our schools are focused on, actually develop more quickly when you're also developing artistic intelligence, interpersonal intelligence. In other words, we're growing as human beings. All facets grow. One last story, and then I'll shut up. I'll never forget a dinner conversation one evening with a man named Victor Weisskopf. So Victor was the head of the physics department at MIT, a very famous physicist. He was part of the Manhattan Project. If you remember the Manhattan Project, they're the physicists who developed the atom bomb. So a very eminent nuclear physicist, and then became the head of the department of MIT. But that evening we were talking about our personal stories. And I'll never forget Victor saying, I said, Victor, when did you become a physicist? He said, when I was 4 years old, my aunt played the piano. And I can remember as a 4-year-old, there's nothing I loved better than lying on the ground underneath the piano while she was playing the piano. And he said, that's when I became a physicist. This is not just about logical intelligence or linguistic skills. This is about developing as human beings. And we are all of those things that Nicanor was saying. Any good education system will be grounded in all of the intelligences. And then kids, of course, are all different. Victor wanted to be a physicist. Great. Other kids will want to play the piano. Great. So there's going to be many, many paths, but they're all interconnected because we're human beings. And all those things are inside of us. We are a microcosm.